There are lands that seem born to test a person's limits, where the wind carries the scent of dry dust, where the sun hangs like a red-hot anvil striking down with invisible blows, and where those who remain don't stay, because they've never known hardship, but because they've tasted enough of it to have nothing left to lose. Dakota in 1876 was one such place. And in the middle of that harsh frontier stood a woman as solitary as a lone tree on a sunburned plain, Eliza Boon. At 32, Eliza was well past the age when society out here considered a woman past her season, and even more withered in the eyes of others for being a widow. The land she owned wasn't a gift, but a burden. A farm that had once promised golden harvests now reduced to fields split open like the calloused hands of an old farmer. 3 years of relentless drought had stolen the water from her well, the grass from her fields, and the light from her eyes. Mornings here brought no proud rooster's crow, no splash of fresh water drawn from the well. Instead, there was only the sound of wind snapping through the dry well's frame, the frayed rope worn so thin it might snap with one hard pull. Each day, Eliza still stood at the rim of the well, staring into its hollow dark, as if by sheer patience she could summon the miracle of years past, when her parents were alive, when every bucket came up brimming with cold, sweet water. But the only thing that ever rose from its depths now was silence. Eliza had lost more than water. She had lost people. She'd lost her husband 6 years ago to the sudden kick of a draft horse. She'd lost her parents at 12 in a blood-soaked incident on the road west to what they'd hoped would be a better life. Friends and neighbors had trickled away one by one as the land failed to feed them. Families like the Hendersons and the Millers, once anchors in her world, had loaded their wagons and headed back east, leaving behind gaps that dust and wind rushed in to fill. To the townsfolk, Eliza was the embodiment of stubbornness that bordered on recklessness. Anyone else in her shoes would have sold the land, scraped together what little money was left, and found an easier place to survive. But Eliza stayed. Maybe it was because of a promise to her late husband that she would keep this land. Maybe it was the unyielding belief that if she had survived so much loss, she couldn't let a drought beat her. Or maybe deep down, there was simply nowhere else to go. Her days revolved around small back-breaking tasks, patching rotted fence lines to keep out stray cattle nursing along a few scraggly hens, and scraping together pennies from the sale of eggs and the occasional bundle of firewood. Each morning she'd visit the chicken coop, her calloused hand sliding beneath a hen's warm belly, searching for the faint hope of an egg, one tiny sign that life here still had the will to continue. But debt had no patience. The bankman from town had knocked on her door more than 3 times this summer. Each visit came with a tone of understanding, but eyes that measured the worth of every item in her house. The bank had given her time, but everyone knew that when the day came, the land would be seized whether she was ready or not. The prevailing feeling in Eliza's life was a thick, unmoving solitude, not just the physical kind, but the gnawing loneliness that made every sound and sight echo with emptiness. Yet twined with that was something harder, a stone-set defiance. Dakota could take her water her crops, even the people she loved, but it hadn't yet broken Eliza Boon's will. Some nights, sitting by the light of an oil lamp, she'd look out the window to where darkness stretched unbroken to the horizon. She'd think about all the times she'd almost given up. And yet, every morning, she still rose pulled on her faded dress, stepped into cracked-heeled boots, and began a day that looked exactly like the one before, except a little harder. And it was in this state, between the cracks in the earth and the cracks in her heart, that a turning point was waiting. A county auction was set to take place where men would be sold like cattle to pay their debts. The news spread like wildfire, and everyone was talking about the merchandise that would be paraded on the block. To most, it was just business. But for Eliza Boon, it would be the first step onto a road she'd never imagined setting in motion. Events that would upend everything she thought she knew about herself, her past, and about one mysterious man she'd believed was gone from her life forever. That morning, the sun wasn't yet over the ridge before the heat began pressing down, odd heat with no wind, as if the air itself had been hung up and left to bake. Eliza was loading a few baskets of eggs into the wagon when she wondered if it was worth the trip into town. 3 miles of dust for an auction she didn't much care for. But the same way she still looked down that dry well each morning, she felt pulled by something part thin hope, part survival instinct. They called it a debt labor auction, a strange custom that had started back east and worked its way here. Men who couldn't pay their debts were sold off, their labor contracted to whoever paid for them. On paper, it sounded humane, giving a man a chance to work off what he owed. But Eliza knew better. It was just a legal way to turn people into merchandise. By the time her wagon rattled into the courthouse square, the place looked more like a fairground than a seat of justice. People jostled shoulder to shoulder, boots clomped across the boardwalk. The smell of sweat and dust mixed with the shouts of peddlers hawking fried pies and boiled peanuts. On a makeshift wooden stage, a squat man in a too-tight vest Bixby cattle trader turned auctioneer was testing a brass bell. Each clang rang out like a call to witness something ugly. The first lots went up a bright-eyed young man with soft hands, a bent-backed farmer, a graying carpenter. Prices shifted depending on skill and build. Men were bid on, clapped for, and talked over the way folks haggled for a sturdy mule. Eliza stayed toward the back, the $2.17 in her skirt pocket, feeling like a stone reminder she wasn't here to buy. That amount would barely stretch to flour and salt. Sometimes people came to these things, not to purchase, but to see just how low fortunes could sink. The air shifted when Bixby called Lot 17. 2 deputies led a man forward. He was so tall he had to duck under the stage beam. His shoulders were broad enough to block the sky, his wrists chained behind him, shirt torn in several places. But it wasn't his size that made the crowd draw back. It was the burlap sack tied tight around his head, mottled with the dark stains of dried blood. Whispers rippled. That's the one who killed Sheriff Davidson in Deadwood, with his bare hands. He hasn't spoken a word since they took him. Cursed, maybe. No one stepped forward. Even Bixby, who'd sold his share of mean-tempered horses, looked uneasy. Opening at $5, he called. Silence. 3. Still nothing. The only sound was the wood groaning under the man's weight. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted this particular piece of it. Eliza felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't know if it was the way the late light caught on the sack, or the way he stood so still, but she saw herself in that figure cornered, priced like a worn-out tool. $2. Bixby's voice took on a note of pleading. Before her mind could talk her out of it, Eliza's hand went up. Here she said, her voice carrying clear enough to make a few heads turn. The air went stiff. Behind her, Martha Kellerman, the neighbor with a sharp tongue, hissed, "Eliza, have you lost your senses?" But Eliza's hand didn't waver. There was no counter bid. Sold to Miss Boon. $2, Bixby declared, relief plain in his voice at having moved this particular lot. When the deputies unlocked the chain and handed her the paper granting labor rights, Eliza felt as though she'd just signed a contract with fate itself. She didn't know his name, hadn't seen his face, only knew that in a few minutes he'd be riding in her wagon back to her dry, lonesome patch of earth. Eyes followed as she led him from the square, eyes holding a mix of pity and the anticipation of disaster. She didn't look back. Her steps were firm, the same as they'd been when she chose to keep the land through drought, or keep the hens when the grass gave up and died. The road back felt longer than usual. Wagon wheels ground over dry gravel, the clink of chain still lingering from his wrists. Neither of them spoke. Glancing over her shoulder now and then, she saw him sitting upright, silent, as if her presence didn't exist at all. Yet she could feel the weight of him, not just muscle, but the kind of weight that came with whatever story lay under that burlap sack. At the farm, she showed him to the empty barn, pointed out where he could sleep, the dry well, the sagging fence. For reasons she didn't stop to name, she didn't remove the sack. Maybe it was a scrap of dignity for someone who'd already been paraded for sale, or maybe she feared what she'd see. Evening settled in, burning red across the cracked earth. Eliza stood on the porch looking toward the still figure in the barn's shadows, and wondered had she just saved a man, or brought home a storm. That first night Eliza barely slept. The creak of wind pushing through the barn's loose boards came at steady intervals, mingled with the faint clink of loosened chains whenever the man shifted. She lay in bed with her eyes open, listening to every sound. It wasn't exactly fear, more a feeling she couldn't quite name, part watchfulness, part curiosity. When the first gray light of morning slipped in through the doorframe, Eliza pulled on a thin wool sweater and stepped outside. The air held a faint trace of dew mixed with dry dust. Her horse had been fed. The sagging fence had been braced with fresh-cut boards. She stopped in her tracks a little thrown. When had he done all that? He was sitting on the barn steps, hands free, but resting neatly on his knees. The burlap sack lay crumpled beside him. In the dim light, she saw a sunburned face, a rough beard, and a long scar running from his left cheek down toward his jaw. But it wasn't the scar that made her pause. It was the eyes, deep and still like a lake on a windless morning, but carrying something familiar. "Jonah," he said quietly, his voice low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a creek bed. Eliza frowned. "What my name?" "Jonah." He looked straight at her, and as if reading the question in her eyes added, "We've met before, a long time ago." At first she wanted to dismiss it, but then pieces of memory began to stir, like someone lifting the dusty cloth off an old trunk. She saw herself at 12, huddled in a small clapboard house on the outskirts of Deadwood, the night ripped open by gunfire and screams. Bandits poured in. Flames roared up. She remembered the acrid sting of smoke, the hot streak of tears down her cheeks. And she remembered a large hand pulling her through the window, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a flour sack. A man's voice whispering, "Run for the wagon. Don't look back." In the memory, that figure went back into the burning house, bringing out one child after another, before disappearing into the dark. No one knew who he was. No one ever found him afterward. Eliza swallowed hard. "That was you?" Jonah nodded. "Yes. You were the little girl hiding behind the kitchen cupboard. You handed me the knife so I could cut the ropes off the others." A wave of feeling surged through Eliza: gratitude, astonishment, a little dizziness. For 20 years this face had existed only in fragments of memory, in questions that had no answers. Now he was sitting right in front of her, flesh and blood, in the role of a lot she'd just bought for $2. "You vanished. Nobody knew your name. I thought—" She let the thought trail off. Jonah shrugged, eyes drifting toward the horizon. Sometimes disappearing is the only way to stay alive. They sat in silence for a long while, the only sounds the wind and the barn door creaking. Eliza lowered herself onto the step across from him. "So, now you're here. What do you plan to do?" His mouth curved in a faint, almost tired smile. "Work. Repay the debt I owe you from a long time ago." She shook her head. "That debt was paid the night you saved me." Jonah held her gaze long enough for her to feel it reach into places she thought she'd sealed off. "No," he said slowly. "I only paid half." Those words settled heavy in her chest. There was something Jonah wasn't saying, a story behind those still eyes, behind the scar and the blood-stained sack. A story that had begun the night of the fire 20 years ago, and hadn't yet ended. When Jonah stood, his shadow blotted out the pale morning light. "You don't have to believe me," he said, "but the time will come when you'll have to choose to otherwise. Everything will be lost." Eliza watched as he walked towards the dry well, shoulders squared, as if bracing against the whole sky. And deep in her chest, an old feeling stirred, the same one that had made her run toward a stranger's whispered words all those years ago. The belief that even in a dangerous world, there were still hands that would reach out at the right moment. In the days that followed, Jonah didn't wait to be told what to do. He set to work as if the place were his own. By the time Eliza was stoking the morning fire, the sound of a hammer carried from the barn mingled with the smell of freshly cut pine. He replaced rotted beams, fixed the hinges on the stall doors, swept away the musty straw that had sat too long. By midday, he was at the well shirt, stripped off his sun-browned back, and solid muscles working steadily as he hauled up bucket after bucket of gravel and silt from the dry bottom. More than once, Eliza thought about telling him to rest, but each time she saw the way he worked, steady patient, saying little she let it be. There was something about Jonah that made you want to watch in silence, as though speaking might disturb a fragile balance that had only just settled in. Evenings they ate at the small kitchen table. Eliza cooked plain meals, beans, cornbread, sometimes a bit of salted pork. Jonah ate slowly, spoke little, but always washed the dishes afterward. They didn't ask each other deep questions. She didn't ask about the long scar on his cheek, and he didn't ask why she stayed on this patch of stubborn earth. Everything moved along like an unspoken pact. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Then bits and pieces of truth began to slip through, not from his mouth, but from the world around them. One late afternoon in town, Eliza overheard two freighters talking by the water trough. Word is Davidson's neck snapped with one blow. The man who did it. They say he's working off his debt at Widow Boon's place. The other lowered his voice. I know why. That little Chinese girl from the laundry. Davidson was drunk, dragged her into an alley. This fellow saw it, and he ended the sentence with a chopping motion. Eliza stopped in her tracks, heart thumping harder. She thought of Jonah's still-guarded eyes, his talk about disappearing to stay alive. When she returned home, she didn't mention what she'd heard, but she found herself studying him, looking for a sign that might confirm it. The answer came on a moonless night. The wind pushed through the grass, the barn door hinge squealed. Jonah was sitting on the porch, hands clasped, staring into the dark. You've heard the story, he said without turning. Eliza sat down beside him. Is it true? Jonah's sigh was heavy, as if carrying the weight of memory. His telling was short, but there were places where the words caught in his throat. That night he'd seen Davidson still wearing the badge and coat of a U.S. Marshal, pinning a Chinese girl, no more than 10 years old, into a shadowed corner. Jonah pulled him away. Words turned to shoving, then to blows. Davidson went for his gun, but Jonah was faster. One strike. The man's neck broke. Eliza. I knew no one would believe me. In a town like this, the word of an orphan drifter never wins against the word of a marshal. He looked down at his hands, a faint tremor in his fingers, as if he could still feel the force of that moment. I didn't run because I feared the law. I ran because if I stayed, I'd be hanging from a rope before I opened my mouth. Eliza said nothing, listening to the wind slap against the siding. In her mind, the image of the small Chinese girl, tiny trembling, merged with her own memory of being pulled from the flames by a stranger's hands 20 years ago. She realized there was an invisible thread between them, that instinct to step into danger to save someone else, no matter the cost. In the days after, she didn't press him for more, but her eyes on him changed. Each time she saw him bent over the well or leaning into the fence line, she didn't just see a bound laborer. She saw a man carrying the burden of hard choices and the price you pay for doing the right thing in a world that prefers the easy way. The well finally yielded water. That day Jonah hauled up the first brimming bucket, sweat running with the cool droplets, and handed it to her without a word. Eliza drank the chill running down her throat, but her heart felt heavier. She knew the whole truth hadn't yet surfaced, and when it did, she suspected it would be a wave bigger than any drought either of them had faced. That morning, Eliza went out to the barn, looking for a shovel to move the pile of dirt Jonah had dug from the well to the garden edge. Digging through the shadowed corner where old crates were stacked, her hand struck a small chest, the lock long rusted. She tapped it lightly, and the lid sprang open. Inside wasn't tools, but a worn leather notebook and an old yellowed photograph. She lifted the notebook and flipped a few pages, her pulse quickening. The handwriting leaned slightly, but was steady, each entry marked with dates, places, and details, bribes Davidson had taken, property he'd seized, witnesses he'd silenced. Names she recognized leapt out: store owners, ranchers, even a local judge. Every page sliced at the polished image Davidson had worn in public. The photograph made her hand tremble. The image was blurred, but clear enough to show Jonah 20 years younger, standing among a group of dirt-smudged children with bright, wide eyes. At the edge of the frame, she recognized herself a girl, with 2 braids clutching the sleeve of a younger child. Proof that Jonah's story hadn't been a fabrication. She slipped both items into her apron, just as Jonah called from the well. All that day she worked with her mind, circling one question: could these be enough to change his fate? The answer came sooner than she expected, and not the way she wanted. The next afternoon, the sound of pounding hooves rose in the distance. 4 riders came into the yard, federal badges gleaming on their coats. The leader, a broad man with a full beard, spoke in a voice hard as iron. "Jonah Harper, you're under arrest for the murder of Marshal Davidson. Warrants signed. You'll come with us." Jonah stood still, offering no resistance. Eliza stepped forward, planting herself between them. "You're not taking him." The bearded man frowned. "Mrs. Boon, this is federal business. Step aside." But she didn't move. She pulled the notebook and the photograph from her apron and held them up. "Before you lock up an innocent man, you should see this. Every bribe Davidson took, every beating he gave, every time he threatened to kill a witness. It's all in here. And this," she lifted the photo higher, "is him 20 years ago, saving me and these children from a gang of killers. He's no murderer. He stopped a predator wearing a lawman's badge from doing something vile to a child." For a long moment, the air was taut as a drawn bowstring. Wind swept across the yard, carrying the smell of dust and horse sweat. One of the younger deputies glanced sideways at the bearded man, uncertainty in his eyes. "We can't make that call here," the bearded man said finally, his tone lower now. "But I'll note it. You should know bringing charges against a dead marshal won't be easy." "Not easy," Eliza shot back, "but necessary." In the end, they decided to take Jonah, but not throw him straight into the county jail. The bearded man called it protective holding, while the matter was looked into. They shackled Jonah's wrists, but when he turned his eyes toward Eliza, there was no defeat there, only a quiet flicker of gratitude. She stood in the yard long after the riders disappeared into the dusty horizon. She knew she'd just stepped into a fight far bigger than keeping her land or surviving a drought. This was a battle with the very machinery of power itself, where truth didn't win on its own. It had to be held onto with both hands and never let go, no matter the cost. And Eliza, a widowed rancher with nothing but a patch of stubborn ground, knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let the hands that had saved her 20 years ago vanish into the dark a second time. Jonah rode away in the hard afternoon wind, his figure shrinking against the rising columns of dust. Eliza stayed on the porch, her hand gripping her apron as if to hold on to whatever warmth lingered. The words of the federal marshal still echoed in her ears: protective holding for the safety of a witness. Not a sentence, but not freedom either. By the next morning, the town was buzzing. Some said Jonah was being held in secret to give a statement. Others claimed it was just a way to stall before a hanging. Martha Kellerman came out to the ranch pretending to bring cornbread, but clearly fishing for details. "You sure you know what you're doing?" Eliza trusting a man like that's like hugging a lit powder keg. Eliza only smiled faintly. "I know exactly who I'm trusting." The words shut Martha up, but they also made Eliza admit something to herself: she'd chosen this path the moment she'd raised her hand and bid $2 at that auction. Without Jonah, the ranch fell quiet. The work piled onto Eliza's shoulders, but she didn't complain. Each morning she still went to the well, now brimming with water, drew a bucketful and set it on the porch, as if keeping a piece of him here. 1 week passed, then 2. A letter came with a federal seal stating that a formal investigation had been opened. The leather ledger and the photograph she'd handed over were now evidence under review. No conclusion yet, it read, but the direction of inquiry has changed. That night, Eliza sat by the fire reading over the copied pages she'd kept. The dates, the names, the amounts, everything was too precise to ignore. She knew that if the investigators did their job, Jonah would be cleared. But she also knew that in this world, truth could take a long time to overtake a lie that had taken root. Some nights she stepped out to the porch looking down the road toward town, imagining Jonah walking back toward her, carrying that worn canvas bag, smiling with a calm in his eyes. In the picture she held in her mind, she could almost hear him say, "I told you, Eliza, there'd come a time you'd have to choose to believe." News from town carried both hope and warning. A horse trader muttered to her at the market, "If Jonah walks free, someone's gonna lose face, and around here losing face can be deadlier than prison." Eliza just nodded, her gaze steady. She kept at her work, mending fence, feeding stock, tending the fire through the cold wind. But inside, she'd built another fence entirely, a fence of faith, one no rumor or threat could knock down. Near the end of the 3rd month, a telegram arrived. Short-clipped, but enough to make her heart pound. Investigation progressing. Jonah safe. Wait. Just those last words, wait, were all she needed to know. She would stand here for as long as it took. Folding the telegram, she slipped it into her coat pocket and stepped out onto the porch. The evening breeze carried the fresh scent of the well water. The road to town stretched long and dusty before her. But to Eliza, it was nothing more than a temporary distance. Because once you've chosen to believe, she knew any distance can be closed. The day began like any other. Eliza rose before dawn, stoked the fire, fed the hens, then carried her bucket to the well. But as she walked back towards the porch, she saw a lone rider in the distance. It was the postmaster from town, a rare sight this far out, carrying an envelope sealed with red wax, rare enough that Eliza knew it had to be important. Inside was a carbon copy of a telegram, the paper thin and the type crisp, to the office of the U.S. Territorial Marshal Dakota, confirming Jonah Harper, former Deputy Special Agent of the Territorial Bureau of Justice, engaged in an investigation into Marshal Davidson for abuse of authority and corruption. Have received evidentiary materials from witness Eliza Boon. Immediate release requested and safe transport to be provided. Signed Samuel Briggs, Regional Director. Eliza read it 3 times before she could trust her eyes. In an instant, all the scattered pieces fell into place, his sharp way of noticing things. The silence when it mattered, the disciplined precision behind every move. Jonah wasn't only the man who'd saved her life, not only a fugitive in the wrong place at the wrong time, he had been a federal agent, and Davidson's death was just the jagged edge of a far deeper case. The first feeling that hit was relief, like a weight pressing on her chest for weeks had suddenly lifted. But it was chased by a rush of heat she couldn't quite name, somewhere between pride and anger. Pride that Jonah had always stood on the right side of things. Anger that he'd kept it hidden, letting her live in fear longer than she had to. That afternoon, the federal riders returned. This time, the man in front no longer wore the hard suspicion in his eyes. He stepped down, handed her the official telegram, and said, "Mrs. Boon, Mr. Harper is to be released. And he's asked to speak to you before we move him out." Jonah stepped from the line of horses, no shackles on his wrists. His shirt was clean, his face still tired, but his eyes were clearer, lighter, as if some of the weight had slid from his shoulders. "Eliza," he said, his voice steady, but gentler than before, "I owe you an apology. And an explanation." Piece by piece, he told her the full story. Months earlier, he'd been sent to gather evidence against Davidson, who was suspected of using his badge to enrich himself and protect a criminal network. The mission unraveled when Davidson realized the truth and moved to eliminate him and anyone who might speak against him. That punch that night, Jonah said, was to save that girl's life. But it also meant my cover was gone. I planned to disappear. Until you showed up with $2 and a look in your eyes that didn't flinch. Eliza let the words settle before asking quietly, "And now?" Jonah replied, the faintest smile touching his lips. "I'll finish the job. You gave me the last piece of what I needed." He paused, his gaze softening. "And if you'll allow it when it's done, I'd like to come back. Not as an agent, just as Jonah." The words filled her chest with something she couldn't quite name, a strange mix of ease and the sense of a promise hanging just over the horizon. When the Federal riders left with Jonah this time, Eliza didn't feel fear. She stood on the porch and watched them go, knowing she would wait. Not in doubt, but in a trust that had been tested and proven. The evening sky burned red, the wind carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass. Eliza's smile was small, but certain. The truth had finally spoken, and her faith, though it had swayed at times, had never been misplaced. The news came at first light, not through rumor or a letter, but in the thud of hooves pounding the dirt road to the ranch. Eliza stepped out onto the porch just as the dust cloud parted to reveal Jonah. No federal escort this time, no shackles, no grim-faced deputies. Just Jonah. He swung down from his horse, a small duffel slung over one shoulder, his stride steady but unhurried. "Well," he said, that faint smile tugging at one corner of his mouth, "looks like they finally figured it out." Eliza searched his face for any shadow of doubt, but found none. "So, you're free," Jonah confirmed, "and not going anywhere." The words seemed to hang between them, weighty and impossible to misread. For weeks she'd lived with the thought that he could vanish at any moment, like he had all those years ago. But now, there was something different in his tone, a groundedness as if he'd already chosen his next trail, and it ended right here. Inside over coffee, Jonah reached into his bag and pulled out a small worn box. The leather was scuffed from years of travel, the clasp nearly worn through. He set it on the table and slid it toward her. Eliza raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Something I've been carrying a long time," Jonah said. "Bought it years back. Didn't know if I'd ever use it. Figured maybe someday I'd find the right reason." She opened it slowly. Inside lay 2 silver bands, simple but hand-worked, the kind of rings that felt solid in the palm, and heavier in meaning than in weight. The metal had dulled with time, but the intent behind it shone clear. "I'm not asking today," Jonah said, his voice steady. "But I want you to know, if there's a future worth building, I'm ready for it. I've been ready for a long time." Eliza closed the box gently, her hands resting on it as if to keep it from sliding away. She thought of the drought, the debt, the lonely years holding this place together, of the night at the auction, of the long weeks when hope felt like a candle guttering in the wind. And she thought of this man, showing up in chains, yet standing now as free as any soul could be, and what it meant for him to choose here. The day passed in quiet work. Jonah repaired a sagging fence line. Eliza tended to the animals. There was no grand declaration, no rush, just the slow settling of 2 people learning the rhythm of shared space again. As the sun dipped low, they met on the porch. The last light stretched long over the fields, catching the dust motes in the air like flecks of gold. Jonah took a breath as if to say something, but Eliza beat him to it. "Welcome home," she said simply. Something shifted in Jonah's face, an almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw, a blink as though holding back more than he could say. He stepped up beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed, and they stood watching the land fade into dusk. It wasn't a wedding. It wasn't a promise sealed in stone, but it was something truer than either an opening a first page of whatever came next. And here's the thing about stories like this, out here on the edge of the frontier. Next isn't guaranteed. Land changes hands. Laws bend under the weight of men with power. Droughts come back. Old enemies remember your name. But if there's one thing worth betting on, it's a pair of people stubborn enough to keep choosing each other in a place where nothing is easy. If you've been with them this far through the dust, the doubt, the waiting don't stop now. Stand with them. Tell their story. Because somewhere down the line, when another fight comes to their door, the weight of all those who believe might just tip the balance. And maybe, just maybe, when the time is right, those silver bands will find their place not as a symbol of an ending, but of a life they fought to build together, ring by ring, day by day.